The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church in Bakersfield, California, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews where Rebecca Thompson had sat every Sunday for the past 15 years. As the children's ministry coordinator, she knew every hymn by heart, could recite Bible verses with ease, and was often held up as an example of Christian devotion by Pastor Williams. But this Sunday, Rebecca's hands trembled as she clutched her purse, knowing that inside lay the evidence of her secret shame, a maxed-out credit card she'd used at Thunder Valley Casino just 12 hours earlier. "Mommy, are you okay?" whispered her 8-year-old daughter Lily, tugging at Rebecca's navy blue dress, the same dress she'd bought on credit 3 months ago when her clothing budget had mysteriously disappeared. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Rebecca whispered back, forcing a smile as Pastor Williams began his sermon on stewardship and financial responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on her. Rebecca's descent into gambling had begun innocently enough 6 months earlier. Her husband, David, a construction foreman, had been injured on a job site, leaving them struggling to cover medical bills and maintain their comfortable middle-class lifestyle. When her sister mentioned the girls' night out at the local casino, Rebecca had gone along reluctantly, armed with just $40 and the firm intention of spending no more than that. She'd won $300 that first night playing blackjack. The rush of victory, the feeling of having solved their financial problems so easily, had been intoxicating. What she didn't realize was that she'd just placed the first bet in a game she was destined to lose. After church, Rebecca stood in the fellowship hall, accepting compliments on the children's Easter program she'd organized while mentally calculating how much money she could borrow from the program's budget to cover her losses from the night before. The thought made her sick, but the alternative, admitting to David that she'd gambled away their emergency fund, seemed impossible. "Rebecca, you look tired," said Martha Henderson, the church treasurer and Rebecca's closest friend. "Is everything okay at home with David's recovery?" "Oh, you know how it is," Rebecca replied, her practiced smile never wavering. "Just the usual stress of managing everything while he heals. Nothing that prayer can't handle." But as she loaded Lily into their Honda Pilot and drove home to their modest 3-bedroom house on Oleander Avenue, Rebecca knew that her prayers had become increasingly desperate and unfocused. Instead of seeking guidance and strength, she'd been bargaining with God, promising to give up gambling if he would just let her win back what she'd lost just this once. David was in his recliner watching football when they arrived home, his injured leg elevated on a pillow. He smiled as Lily ran to hug him, and Rebecca felt a stab of guilt at how trusting and loving his expression remained. He had no idea that while he'd been faithfully attending physical therapy and doing everything possible to return to work, his wife had been systematically destroying their financial security. "How was service?" he asked, reaching for Rebecca's hand as she sat on the arm of his chair. "Pastor Williams spoke about being good stewards of God's blessings," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately," David said thoughtfully. "Once I'm back to work, I want us to be more intentional about our giving, maybe even increase our tithe. God has been so good to us through this injury, providing for us when I couldn't work, keeping our family together and strong." Rebecca nodded and murmured agreement, all while her phone buzzed with a text notification from the casino's rewards program. "Rebecca, your VIP status earns you a free dinner for 2 plus $50 in slot play. See you tonight." She deleted the message quickly, but the damage was done. The seed of temptation had been planted, and she could already feel it taking root in her mind. 3 weeks later, Rebecca sat in her car in the church parking lot at 10 p.m., staring at the dark windows of the building where she'd once found such peace and purpose. She'd just left Thunder Valley Casino after losing $800, money she'd taken from their joint savings account, telling herself she'd replace it before David noticed. She hadn't won a significant amount in weeks, but the casino had become more than just a place to gamble. It had become her refuge from the crushing weight of financial worry and the constant fear of discovery. In the artificial twilight of the gaming floor, surrounded by the electronic symphony of slot machines and the soft murmur of dealers, she could forget about David's mounting medical bills, Lily's upcoming school expenses, and the lies she was living every day. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, honey, where are you? Lily was asking for you at bedtime." Rebecca closed her eyes, hating how easily the lie came. "I'm at the grocery store. The lines are really long tonight. I'll be home in 20 minutes. Okay. Drive safe. Love you." "Love you too." She ended the call and immediately drove to the 24-hour Walmart, grabbing random items to create the illusion of grocery shopping. As she walked through the fluorescent-lit aisles, she passed other late-night shoppers. A young mother with a crying baby, an elderly man carefully comparing prices on medication, a teenager counting crumpled bills to see if he had enough for a loaf of bread. Everyone here had a legitimate reason for being out so late. Everyone except her. Back home, she found David asleep in his recliner, his physical therapy exercises spread across the side table. A pang of guilt shot through her as she looked at his determined notes and progress charts. While she'd been throwing away their future at a blackjack table, he'd been working tirelessly to recover and return to providing for their family. Lily appeared in her pajamas, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Mommy, where were you? Daddy said you went to buy groceries, but we don't need groceries," out of the mouths of babes. Rebecca knelt down and hugged her daughter, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. Sometimes grown-ups have to run errands, even when it doesn't make sense to little girls. "Let's get you back to bed." As she tucked Lily in, her daughter asked, "Mommy, can we pray together like we used to?" They hadn't prayed together in weeks. Rebecca had been avoiding bedtime routines, always finding excuses to be elsewhere during the quiet moments when families connected. But tonight, faced with her daughter's innocent request, she couldn't refuse. "Dear God," Lily began in her sweet, clear voice, "thank you for our family and for helping Daddy get better. Please help Mommy not to be so sad anymore and help us always tell the truth to each other. Amen." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Even an 8-year-old could see through her facade. After Lily fell asleep, Rebecca sat at their kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, trying to figure out how to cover their expenses with what remained in their checking account. The numbers didn't add up. They were short around $200 for the month, and David's disability payments wouldn't cover the gap. She looked at their joint credit card, the one they kept for emergencies. The available credit was $2,000 it would be. So easy to take a cash advance, go back to the casino, and win back everything she'd lost. She'd done it before, smaller amounts, and it had worked out. The odds had to turn in her favor eventually. Her laptop was already open, and before she could stop herself, she was researching the best blackjack strategies, convinced that with enough knowledge and the right approach, she could beat the house and solve all their problems. It never occurred to her to pray for guidance or strength. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped including God in her decision-making, stopped seeking His wisdom, stopped trusting in His provision. Instead, she'd begun trusting in her own ability to manipulate chance and circumstance. The clock on the microwave showed 1:47 a.m. when she finally went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay next to David, listening to his peaceful breathing, planning her return to the casino and trying not to think about the children's ministry funds that would be so easy to borrow if the credit card plan didn't work out. The notification from their bank arrived on a Tuesday morning while Rebecca was preparing Lily's lunch for school. Insufficient funds glowed on her phone screen. Their mortgage payment had bounced. She stared at the message in disbelief, even though she knew exactly why it had happened. The previous night's sure thing at the poker table had cost them their last $900. David was in the shower getting ready for his first day back to work after 3 months of recovery. He'd been so excited the night before, talking about how good it would feel to provide for his family again, how they could finally start getting ahead financially. Rebecca had smiled and nodded, all while knowing that they were actually further behind than ever. "Mom, you're making my sandwich wrong," Lily observed, watching Rebecca mechanically spread peanut butter on bread. "You always cut the crusts off." Rebecca looked down at her hands, which were shaking slightly. She'd been up until 4 a.m. researching gambling strategies online, convinced that she could develop a system to win back everything they'd lost. The lack of sleep, combined with the constant anxiety, was taking its toll. "Sorry, sweetheart, Mommy's just distracted this morning." After dropping Lily at school, Rebecca sat in the parking lot of Bakersfield Elementary and called the bank. The conversation was humiliating, explaining that the bounced payment was a mistake, that funds would be available soon, begging them not to report it to the credit agencies. The customer service representative was professional, but clearly skeptical. Her phone rang as she was driving home. "Pastor Williams." "Rebecca, I hope you don't mind me calling. Martha mentioned that you seemed stressed lately, and I wanted to check in. As one of our key ministry leaders, your well-being is important to all of us." The kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. For a moment, she considered telling him everything: the gambling, the debt, the lies. Pastor Williams had counseled families through financial crises before. Maybe he could help. "We're just dealing with some challenges related to David's injury," she said instead. "Nothing we can't handle with God's help." "Of course. But remember, Rebecca, that God often provides help through his people. If you and David need anything, prayer, practical support, financial assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's what the church family is for." After hanging up, Rebecca pulled into her driveway and sat in the car, crying for the first time in weeks. The weight of her deception was becoming unbearable, but the thought of facing the consequences seemed even worse. How could she look David in the eye and tell him that while he'd been fighting to recover from his injury, she'd been gambling away their children's future? Inside, she found David in their home office, looking over their bills with a confused expression. "Honey, can you help me understand something? Our bank statement shows several large cash withdrawals over the past month, but I can't figure out what they were for. And this credit card statement..." He held up the papers, his brow furrowed. "We've never carried a balance this high before." Rebecca's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. This was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating for months. There were some unexpected expenses while you were recovering. Medical bills, co-pays, things like that. I handled them so you could focus on getting better." David studied her face, and she could see the exact moment when doubt crept into his expression. After 12 years of marriage, he knew her tells, knew when she wasn't being completely honest. "Rebecca, these withdrawals, some of them were made at odd hours, at locations I don't recognize, and the amounts don't match any medical bills we've received." She opened her mouth to craft another lie, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself saying, "I need to go pick up some things for tonight's church meeting. We can go over all of this later when we have more time." David's face fell. "Rebecca, what church meeting? It's Tuesday afternoon." The lie was so obvious, so poorly constructed, that they both recognized it immediately. David set down the bank statements and looked at his wife with an expression of growing concern and confusion. "Where have you been going, Rebecca?" "Really?" She grabbed, her purse and car keys, her fight-or-flight response kicking in. "I told you, running errands, managing things while you recover. I'll be back in a few hours." As she backed out of the driveway, she saw David standing in their front window, his face a mixture of hurt and bewilderment. But the pull of the casino was stronger than her guilt, stronger than her love for her family, stronger than everything she'd once held sacred. 20 minutes later, she was back at Thunder Valley, using their last available credit to try to win back not just their money, but their marriage, their trust, and their future. The call came at 2:30 a.m. Rebecca was still at the casino, down $3,200 for the night and frantically trying to devise a strategy to win it back, when her phone rang with David's contact photo. A picture of him smiling and holding Lily at a church picnic last summer. "Rebecca, where are you?" His voice was tight with worry and barely controlled anger. Lily woke up crying. She had a nightmare and wanted her mom, but you're not here. Again. The casino's artificial atmosphere of perpetual twilight had made her lose track of time completely. She'd thought it was maybe midnight, certainly not late enough for Lily to wake up from bad dreams. I'm at Martha's house. We were talking about the Easter program and lost track of time. I'll be right home. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Rebecca thought the call had dropped. Then David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca, I called Martha looking for you an hour ago. She said she hadn't seen you since Sunday service." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. All of her carefully constructed lies, all of her elaborate stories crumbled in an instant. There was no explaining this away, no reasonable story that would account for where she'd been spending her evenings for the past several months. "David, I can explain. Come home, now. We need to talk." The 30-minute drive from Thunder Valley to their house felt like hours. Rebecca rehearsed different versions of the truth, trying to find one that wouldn't destroy everything. Maybe she could minimize it, make it sound like a recent problem, a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by stress. Maybe she could convince him that she had everything under control. David was waiting in the living room when she arrived, still in his pajamas but clearly wide awake. The bank statements and credit card bills were spread across the coffee table, like evidence at a crime scene. "Sit down," he said quietly. Rebecca perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. In the lamplight, she could see how much weight David had lost during his recovery, how much gray had appeared in his hair. She'd been so focused on her own struggles that she'd barely noticed her husband's. "I've been going through our finances." "While you were out," David began, his voice carefully controlled, "I found the casino reward card in your purse. I found the gambling app on your phone. I found withdrawal slips from ATMs at Thunder Valley dating back 4 months. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Rebecca had thought she'd been so careful, so discreet. "David, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." His voice broke slightly. "My wife, the woman I trusted to manage our family's finances while I was unable to work, has been gambling away our children's future. Our mortgage is in default, our credit cards are maxed out, and according to this bank statement, we have $47 left in our checking account." The numbers, laid out so starkly, were devastating even to Rebecca. She'd been so focused on individual bets, individual losses, that she'd never stepped back to see the full scope of the damage. "How much?" David asked. "Total. How much have you lost?" Rebecca had been avoiding this calculation for months, but faced with David's direct question, she couldn't evade it any longer. About $15,000. David's face went white. 15,000. "Rebecca, that's more than I make in 6 months. That's Lily's college fund. That's our emergency savings. He stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. In the silence, Rebecca could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the same clock they'd received as a wedding gift 12 years ago. "I need you to leave," David said finally, without turning around. "What?" Tonight, pack a bag and go stay with your sister or at a hotel or wherever you've been going when you lied to me about church meetings. But I need you out of this house before Lily wakes up." The finality in his voice terrified her more than any losing streak ever had. "David, please, we can work through this. I'll get help. I'll stop gambling. I'll fix this. You'll fix this." He turned around and she saw tears on his face. "Rebecca, you've stolen from our family. You've lied to me every single day for months. You've abandoned our daughter to Chase, some fantasy of easy money. How exactly do you plan to fix the fact that I can't trust you anymore?" The truth of his words hit her like a slap. She had stolen from them. She had abandoned Lily. She had betrayed every vow they'd made to each other, not just the wedding vows, but the daily promises of honesty, partnership, and putting family first. "Please don't make me leave," she whispered. "I know I've made mistakes, but this is still my home, my family, your family." David's voice was filled with a pain so deep it made Rebecca physically ill. "When was the last time you tucked Lily in at night? When was the last time you asked about my physical therapy? When was the last time you were actually present for us instead of planning your next trip to the casino?" Rebecca opened her mouth to answer, but realized she couldn't remember. The gambling had consumed everything: her time, her attention, her love, her priorities. Even when she'd been physically present, her mind had been elsewhere, calculating odds and planning strategies. She packed a bag in silence, while David sat in their bedroom chair, watching to make sure she didn't take anything that wasn't hers. As she zipped up her suitcase, she caught sight of herself in their dresser mirror. The woman looking back at her was hollow-eyed and unfamiliar, a stranger wearing her face. "I love you," she said as she reached the front door. "I love you and Lily more than anything." David met her eyes for the first time since she'd come home. "If that were true, Rebecca, we wouldn't be here right now." Rebecca's sister Jennifer lived in a small apartment complex in Fresno, about an hour south of Bakersfield. When Rebecca showed up at 4 a.m. with a suitcase and red-rimmed eyes, Jennifer took one look at her and opened the door without questions. "How bad is it?" Jennifer asked, once they were sitting at her tiny kitchen table with cups of coffee neither of them really wanted. The whole story came pouring out. The gambling, the lies, the financial devastation, David's ultimatum. Jennifer listened without judgment, occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze Rebecca's hand. "I've destroyed everything," Rebecca said finally. "My marriage, my family's financial security, my daughter's trust in me. And for what? I never even won anything significant. I just kept chasing this fantasy that the next bet would solve all our problems." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. "Becky, do you remember what Mom used to say when we were kids and made mistakes? There's no hole so deep that God's love can't reach down and pull you out. You used to quote that to me when I was going through my divorce." "This is different," Rebecca said bitterly. "I didn't just make a mistake. I systematically destroyed my family's life over months of deliberate choices. I chose gambling over my husband and daughter, again and again and again. And you can choose differently now." Rebecca shook her head. "It's too late. David won't even talk to me. I don't blame him. I wouldn't trust me either." Over the next 3 days, Rebecca called in sick to her part-time job at the church and spent most of her time lying on Jennifer's couch, paralyzed by depression and shame. She tried calling David twice, but both times he'd simply said that he needed more time and that he'd let her know when she could see Lily. On Thursday evening, Jennifer came home from work with a determined expression. "Get dressed. We're going somewhere." "I don't want to go anywhere." "I don't care what you want. You've been wallowing for 3 days, and it's not helping anyone. Get dressed." 20 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of a small church Rebecca didn't recognize. The sign out front read, "New Hope Community Church," and advertised a meeting at 7 p.m., Celebrate Recovery, a Christ-centered recovery program. "Jen, I can't go in there. These people don't know me, and I'm not ready to... You're not ready. To what? Get help. Face your problems. Actually do something besides feel sorry for yourself. Jennifer's words stung because they were true. Rebecca had been so focused on the magnitude of her mistakes that she'd forgotten the possibility of redemption, the hope of healing. Inside, the church was small and welcoming, with worn carpet and mismatched chairs arranged in a circle. About 20 people of various ages sat talking quietly, and Rebecca was surprised to see how normal they all looked. She'd expected to find desperate, broken people who looked like her reflection in Jennifer's bathroom mirror. The meeting began with a prayer, and then people began sharing their stories. A businessman talked about his cocaine addiction. A grandmother spoke about her prescription drug dependency. A young man shared about his struggle with pornography. Each story was different, but Rebecca heard the same themes: the lies, the isolation, the progressive destruction of relationships and responsibilities, the moment when they'd realized they needed help. When it was her turn to speak, Rebecca's voice came out as barely a whisper. My name is Rebecca, and I think I have a gambling problem. The admission hung in the air. The first time she'd said it out loud, the first time she'd claimed ownership of her addiction rather than calling it a series of mistakes or a temporary lapse in judgment. Thank you for sharing, Rebecca, said the group leader, a woman named Carol who had introduced herself as having 5 years of recovery from alcohol addiction. What brought you here tonight? I lost my family, Rebecca said. And then the tears came. Not the bitter tears of self-pity she'd been crying for days, but something deeper, cleaner. I gambled away everything that mattered to me, and I don't know how to fix it. You can't fix it, Carol said gently. That's the first thing you need to understand. You can't fix the damage you've done. You can't control other people's responses to your choices, and you can't gamble your way out of this hole. But God can do what you can't do. After the meeting, Carol approached Rebecca with a worn paperback book. This is our study guide. It's based on the Beatitudes, specifically the one that says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That's where recovery starts, with admitting that you're spiritually bankrupt and that you need a power greater than yourself. As they drove home, Jennifer glanced at her sister. How do you feel? Rebecca considered the question seriously. Scared, but also, I don't know. Hopeful, maybe. For the first time in months, I talked to people who understood what I was going through, people who'd been where I am, and they'd found a way out. They'd found help from God, from each other, from admitting they couldn't do it alone. Rebecca looked at the book Carol had given her. I've been trying to solve this myself for so long, trying to win back the money, trying to manage David's reactions, trying to keep all the lies straight. I never considered that maybe the solution wasn't something I could achieve on my own. That night, for the first time in months, Rebecca prayed, not bargaining with God or asking him to fix her circumstances, but simply acknowledging her complete powerlessness and asking for help to take the next right step, whatever that might be. 6 weeks into her stay at Jennifer's apartment, Rebecca had established a routine that felt foreign but necessary. Morning prayer and meditation, afternoon job searching. She'd been fired from her position at Grace Community Church after missing too many days. Evening celebrate recovery meetings and late-night phone calls with her sponsor Carol, working through the 12 steps of the recovery program. The hardest part wasn't avoiding gambling. Somehow the desire to bet had diminished once she'd admitted powerlessness over her addiction. The hardest part was living with the consequences of her choices while trying to rebuild her relationship with God and eventually her family. David had agreed to let her see Lily twice a week, supervised visits at Jennifer's apartment. Their 8-year-old daughter was struggling to understand why Mommy couldn't come home, why Daddy seemed so sad all the time, why their comfortable life had suddenly become complicated and uncertain. "Mommy, did you do something really bad?" Lily had asked during their third visit, her small hands holding a drawing she'd made of their family, but with Rebecca standing apart from David and herself. Rebecca had looked to Jennifer for guidance, but her sister had simply nodded encouragingly. They talked about this, the importance of age-appropriate honesty. "Yes, sweetheart, Mommy made some very bad choices that hurt our family. I was supposed to take care of our family's money, but instead I lost it by gambling. That means making bets and playing games where you can lose money. Like the lottery. Yes, like the lottery, but much worse. I went to a place called a casino over and over again, and I lost a lot of money that was supposed to pay for our house and food and your school." Lily processed this with the serious concentration she brought to difficult math problems. "Is that why Daddy cries sometimes?" The question broke Rebecca's heart. "Yes, baby. Daddy is very hurt and angry because of what I did, and I don't blame him. Are you going to stop doing the bad thing?" "I already have stopped. I go to meetings now with other people who made the same mistakes, and we help each other learn how to make better choices. And I pray every day asking God to help me be the mommy you deserve." Lily nodded solemnly. "Can you come home when you're all better?" "I don't know, sweetheart. That's up to Daddy. But even if I can't come home right away, I will always love you, and I will keep working to become better." After Lily left, Rebecca sat in Jennifer's living room, working through Step 8 of her recovery program, making a list of all persons she had harmed and becoming willing to make amends to them all. The list was longer than she'd expected. David. Luigi betrayed his trust, jeopardized their financial security, abandoned him during his recovery. Lily neglected her needs, created instability, damaged her sense of security. Jennifer burdened her with housing and emotional support for problems. Rebecca had created Grace Community Church, stolen time and attention, resigned position without proper notice. Her parents would be devastated when they learned the truth. Her co-workers at the church left them scrambling to cover her responsibilities. The children in her ministry abandoned their Easter program preparation. Some amends would be straightforward. She'd already written letters of apology to her former co-workers and Pastor Williams. Others seemed impossible. How do you make amends to an 8-year-old whose childhood security you've shattered? How do you repair trust with a husband who caught you in months of systematic deception? Carol had warned her about this stage of recovery. You'll want to rush into making amends because it feels like doing something concrete to fix your mistakes. But amends aren't about making yourself feel better. They're about taking responsibility for harm you've caused, even when the other person isn't ready to forgive you. David still wasn't ready to talk about reconciliation. He'd started individual counseling to deal with what he called the betrayal trauma of discovering his wife's secret life. Their conversations, when they happened, were limited to logistics. When Rebecca could see Lily, updates on their financial situation, decisions about selling their house. The house. That was the most concrete consequence of Rebecca's gambling. Even with David back to work, they couldn't afford the mortgage payments, and the 3 months of missed payments had started foreclosure proceedings. They'd have to sell, probably, at a loss, and David would need to find an apartment he could afford on his construction worker's salary. "I've been thinking," David had said during one of their brief phone calls, "about what happens next, practically speaking." "Okay." Rebecca's heart had sped up, hoping he might be ready to discuss her coming home. "I think you should declare bankruptcy. Clean slate, fresh start. You can't rebuild your life carrying this much debt." The suggestion was practical and probably necessary, but it felt like another failure, another public admission of how completely She'd destroyed their financial foundation. What about us? She'd asked quietly. Is there going to be an US to rebuild? The silence had stretched so long she'd thought he'd hung up. Finally, I don't know, Rebecca. I want there to be. I love you, I love our family, but I don't know how to trust you again. And I can't put Lily through any more instability until I know you're really different, not just sorry. That conversation had been 2 weeks ago, and Rebecca was trying to be patient with David's process while working on her own recovery. Carol kept reminding her that she couldn't control the timeline of other people's healing, only her own commitment to changing. Recovery isn't about getting your old life back, Carol had explained. It's about becoming the person God created you to be, whether or not that includes the relationships you damaged along the way. The truth was hard, but somehow liberating. For months, Rebecca had been trying to manage outcomes, control consequences, manipulate circumstances. Learning to focus only on her own choices and God's grace was terrifying and peaceful at the same time. She was different now, not perfect, not fully healed, but genuinely different in ways she could feel in her bones. The obsessive thoughts about gambling had been replaced by gratitude for small mercies. Jennifer's hospitality, Lily's hugs, David's willingness to let her remain in their daughter's life, the growing sense of God's presence in her daily routine. Whether that would be enough to rebuild her family remained to be seen. But for the first time in over a year, Rebecca was more concerned with being faithful to her recovery than with controlling the results. 8 months after Rebecca had been asked to leave her home, she stood in the parking lot of Grace Community Church, holding an envelope that contained the most important letter she'd ever written. Inside was a check for $500, the first installment. On paying back the children's ministry funds she'd borrowed, along with a full confession of her theft and a detailed plan for making complete restitution. She'd found full-time work as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, and while the salary was modest, she'd been able to start setting aside money each month for amends. More importantly, she'd completed the 12 steps of her recovery program and was now sponsoring 2 other women who were struggling with gambling addiction. The Rebecca who walked into Pastor Williams' office that morning was fundamentally different from the one who had fled 8 months earlier. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that came not from having everything figured out, but from learning to trust God with the outcomes she couldn't control. "Rebecca," Pastor Williams said, standing to greet her with a warm smile, "it's so good to see you. Martha told me you've been doing well." They'd maintained contact through Martha Henderson, who had visited Rebecca several times during her recovery and had become one of her strongest supporters. Martha had never made Rebecca feel judged or condemned, instead offering practical help and consistent encouragement. "Pastor, I have something for you," Rebecca said, handing him the envelope. "I need to confess something and make amends for harm I caused to the church." She watched his face as he read her letter, seeing surprise, sadness, and finally something that looked like relief. When he finished, he set the letter aside and looked at her directly. "Rebecca, I had suspected something was troubling you during those last few months. You seemed distracted, anxious, and I could sense you were carrying a heavy burden. I'm sorry I didn't reach out more directly. This wasn't your fault, Pastor. This was my choice, my addiction, my responsibility. But I wanted you to know the truth and to start making things right. And David, Lily, how are they?" Rebecca smiled, the first genuinely joyful expression she'd worn in his presence in over a year. "They're doing well. David and I have been in marriage counseling for 3 months now. It's hard work, rebuilding trust, learning new patterns of communication, dealing with the trauma my choices caused, but we're both committed to the process." What she didn't tell Pastor Williams was how surprised she'd been when David had suggested they try counseling. She'd expected divorce papers, custody arrangements, a legal end to their marriage. Instead, 6 months into her recovery, David had called and asked if she'd be willing to try working on their relationship. "I've been in counseling myself," he'd said during that phone call, "working through the anger and betrayal. My therapist helped me realize that while I can't trust you yet based on your past actions, I can choose to give you the opportunity to prove you've changed." Their first counseling session had been excruciating. Sitting across from David in Dr. Martinez's office, Rebecca had felt the full weight of every lie she'd told, every moment she'd chosen gambling over her family, every time she'd looked him in the eye and deceived him. But she'd also felt something else, hope that their marriage might be salvageable if they were both willing to do the hard work. "The woman I married wouldn't have done what you did," David had said during one particularly difficult session. "But I'm beginning to see that the woman you're becoming might be someone I can learn to trust again." It hadn't been easy. David had every right to remain angry, to refuse reconciliation, to protect himself and Lily from further hurt. The fact that he was willing to try felt like grace Rebecca didn't deserve but desperately needed. "We're taking it slowly," Rebecca told Pastor Williams. "I'm still living with my sister, but David and I have dinner together twice a week, and we're doing family activities with Lily on weekends. We're learning to be honest with each other in ways we never were before, even during the good years." Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "And Lily, how is she handling everything?" "Better than we expected. She's been seeing a counselor too, someone who specializes in helping children whose families have been affected by addiction. She's learned that my gambling wasn't her fault, that she's safe and loved even when adult relationships are complicated." The truth was that Lily had shown remarkable resilience. Children, Rebecca had learned, were often more adaptable than adults when given honest information and consistent support. Lily understood that Mommy had been sick with an addiction, that she was getting better, and that both parents loved her regardless of what happened between them. "Mommy," Lily had said just last week during one of their family dinners, "are you still sick?" "I'm in recovery," Rebecca had explained. "That means I'm getting better every day, but I have to keep working at it. Just like when you had strep throat and had to take medicine every day until you were completely well. Will you always have to work at it?" "Yes, sweetheart, but that's okay, because God gives me strength every day to make good choices." Lily had accepted this explanation with the matter-of-fact way children processed information when it was presented honestly and age-appropriately. "I have something else to tell you," Rebecca said to Pastor Williams, pulling a second envelope from her purse. "I'd like to apply to volunteer with the church's financial ministry, helping people who are struggling with debt and financial crises." Pastor Williams raised his eyebrows. "That's unexpected. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" "I understand your concern," Rebecca said, "but I've learned more about financial recovery in the past 8 months than I learned in my entire previous adult life. I know what it feels like to lose everything, to face bankruptcy, to rebuild from ground zero. And I know how God can provide hope and practical help even in the darkest circumstances." She'd been thinking about this for weeks, discussing it with Carol and her counselor. There was something powerful about the idea of using her painful experience to help others avoid similar mistakes or find their way out of financial chaos. "I'm not asking to handle money or have access to church funds," Rebecca continued. "I'm asking to share my story, to help people understand that financial problems often have emotional and spiritual roots, and to connect them with resources that can provide real help." Pastor Williams was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing her request carefully. Finally, he spoke. "Let me talk to the ministry team and get back to you. I think your heart is in the right place, but we'll need to consider how this would work practically." Rebecca nodded. "I understand completely. And, Pastor, whatever you decide, I'm grateful for this church family and the way you've all supported David and Lily through this crisis. Even when I couldn't be here, you were taking care of my family." As she prepared to leave, Pastor Williams stood and extended his hand. "Rebecca, I want you to know how proud I am of the work you've done to rebuild your life. The woman sitting in my office today is someone I'd be honored to have on our ministry team." Walking back to her car, Rebecca felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in over a year. Not because everything was perfect, her marriage was still fragile, her financial recovery would take years, and she would always be one bad choice away from destroying her progress. But because she finally understood that her worth wasn't determined by her ability to fix her mistakes or control other people's responses to her choices. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "How did it go with Pastor Williams?" "Good," she texted back. "I'll tell you about it at dinner tonight." They'd started having dinner together every Tuesday and Thursday, neutral territory, at a small family restaurant where they could talk without the pressure of being in either of their homes. These dinners had become the foundation of their reconciliation. 2 hours a week, where they practiced being honest, working through conflicts and remembering why they'd fallen in love 12 years earlier. "Rebecca," David had said during their most recent counseling session, "I need you to know that even if we can't make our marriage work, I'm proud of who you're becoming. The woman you are now is someone I respect, even when I'm still angry about what the woman you were did to our family." It was perhaps the most meaningful compliment she'd ever received, because it acknowledged both the reality of her transformation and the legitimacy of his ongoing pain. As Rebecca drove back to Jennifer's apartment, she passed Thunder Valley Casino. The neon signs and flashy advertisements that had once called to her like sirens now seemed garish and desperate. She felt no urge to stop, no curiosity about what games might be running, no fantasy about winning back everything she'd lost. Instead, she felt grateful for the lesson in powerlessness that had led her to surrender control to God, for the people who had loved her even when she couldn't love herself, for the opportunity to rebuild her life on a foundation of honesty and faith rather than deception and false hope. Her phone rang as she pulled into Jennifer's parking lot. It was Carol, her sponsor. "How are you feeling after the meeting with your pastor?" "Peaceful," Rebecca said, realizing as she spoke that it was true. "Whatever happens with the volunteer position, whatever happens with my marriage, I know I'm exactly where God wants me to be right now." "That's recovery," Carol said with a smile in her voice, learning to trust God with the outcomes while staying faithful to the process. That evening, Rebecca sat at Jennifer's kitchen table working on her Step 12 assignment, writing down ways she could carry the message of recovery to other people who were still suffering. At the top of her list, she wrote, "Remember that God's grace is bigger than our worst mistakes, and His love can redeem even the most broken situations." Outside, the California sun was setting over Fresno, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Inside, Rebecca Thompson, former gambling addict, recovering wife and mother, grateful child of God, prepared for another day of choosing. Faith over fear, honesty over deception, and trust over control. Her life looked nothing like it had a year ago, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, it felt like her own. The end.